Roy Clark wasn't just a country music legend, he was a force of pure joy. The banjo-picking, smile-flashing star of hee-haw who could make any stage feel like home. But in 2018, after his passing, the warmth of his memory was shaken by a chilling discovery. While going through his Tulsa home, the family stumbled upon a closet no one had ever seen open. It was locked tight, and Roy had kept it sealed for decades. What they found inside would leave them stunned, and forever change the way they remembered him. Tucked away in the far corner of his private music room stood a closet no one had dared to open. No label. No key. No clue to its contents. But when the lock was finally broken, an uneasy silence filled the air. Inside was not just a collection of personal keepsakes, it was a revelation. Stacks of letters written to complete strangers. Yellowed military files from a past he never spoke about. Unreleased recordings no one had ever heard. And most haunting of all, a single tape marked in his handwriting, "For when I'm gone." It was as if Roy Clark had been guarding a second life, one hidden from even those closest to him. To America, he was the ever-smiling face of hee-haw, the lightning-fast banjo master whose music could lift any spirit. His grin lit up living rooms across the country, and his fingers could turn strings into pure magic. From his quick wit on television to his breathtaking solos on the Grand Ole Opry stage, Roy was joy personified. But inside that locked closet, his family discovered a side of him that would leave them forever changed. But beneath the applause and laughter, those closest to Roy sensed an invisible burden, a weight he carried into every spotlight. Born in Meherrin, Virginia, in 1933, the son of a tobacco farmer and an amateur musician, Roy grew up in a world where hard work wasn't a choice, it was survival. Music was his escape. By 14, he was mastering the guitar with a precision that seemed impossible for his age. By 17, he was a two-time national banjo champion, already earning a reputation as a prodigy. Yet, even in those early triumphs, there were moments when the light in his eyes dimmed, moments when he would quietly retreat from the world. In one rare, unguarded interview, he admitted, "People think if you smile, you're happy. But some smiles are armor." As his career exploded, so did the demands. Television tapings, relentless tours, award shows, interviews, his calendar was a wall of commitments. The show always had to go on, even when he was sick, exhausted, or grieving. He didn't know how to say no. Friends would later describe a man who poured every ounce of himself into his audiences, yet left very little for his own well-being. At home, the weight of fame and the constant grind began to take its toll. Tension grew behind closed doors, a stark contrast to the joy he projected on stage. Roy Clark wasn't just performing music, he was performing happiness, even when it cost him dearly. Though cautious, he was kind and giving. His home was divided into rooms. Not even his kids went in. Rooms that remained locked. And Roy would laugh, dodge, or even crack a joke about hidden banjo caches when questioned about them. However, the joke was always a barrier, a means of diverting attention. There was one closet that caught our attention. It remained silent and unaltered at all times. Roy warned his wife of more than 60 years, Barbara, not to open it. She thought it contained just delicate instruments or obsolete contracts. Roy, however, had a tendency to hide his truths behind melodies. What his tongue dared not tell, his fingers would. The family eventually discovered his unpublished songs, which is why it was so startling. Without the armor, it was Roy. And the family wasn't simply walking into a room when they eventually opened that closet following his death. A hidden chapter in Roy's life was about to begin. One that was composed in silence, protected by shame, and covered by decades of public praise. Everyone believed they knew Roy Clark. However, the man no one ever really saw would be exposed by the contents of that closet. It was more than a place to store things. It was a vault. Hidden in Roy Clark's music room's far corner. Most guests didn't notice the narrow door behind faded awards and amplifiers. Nobody could recall ever seeing it open. Not once. It was always forbidden, according to his kids. Not even his 61-year-old wife, Barbara, had ever seen inside. Roy's response to her inquiries was simply to smile and remark, "That's where the ghosts live," and then he would continue, hiding something, changing the energy, and strumming his banjo. The family eventually made the decision to unlock it after Roy passed away in 2018. They looked through filing cabinets, drawers, and every pocket of their jackets before discovering an antique metal key concealed inside a red velvet-lined guitar case. What they discovered inside wasn't a disorganized mess, and it fit. It was planned, structured, and conserved. Reels of magnetic tape, dozens of manila envelopes, many tied with twine, stacked cardboard boxes with labels written in Roy's handwriting, and a sealed black case. It appeared to have been undisturbed for years. However, they noticed something odd beneath the shelves. There was a faint imprint and line on the closet's back panel. It gave way with a gentle creak, a secret compartment, as they pressed against it. Locked in a smaller box. There was no key for this one. They pried it open. No one had ever seen the pictures inside. Roy is standing next to a military plane. Roy shakes hands with a uniformed man. Wearing clothing from decades ago, Roy appeared melancholy. It was not a showbiz photo shoot. These were private matters of the government. A sealed letter that was addressed to my family exclusively while I was away was later found. The penmanship seemed older, unsteady, and unusual. One cassette with the label, "Play Alone," was found inside the packet. The room became silent. They were torn between fear and tears. They had known Roy Clark. Funny, giving, happy, and all of a sudden like a puzzle with half of its pieces missing. Memorabilia wasn't the only thing in the closet. It had a hidden past. An unseen Roy. The sort of man who silently bore hardships. The type of man who covered scars with laughter. His family was only starting to realize how severe those scars were for the first time. For decades, the closet had waited calmly. And there was no turning back now that it was open. Until the house was deserted, they waited. In the silence of Roy's music room, the family gathered, clutching the cassette as if it were a piece of glass. They discovered a tape player. Under a dusty shelf, Roy's old Realtor deck was still plugged in. After inserting the cassette and pressing play, there was silence for a short while. Then static began to crackle. And lastly, an old, weary, and distinctly Roy Clark voice. "I'm already gone, and I have something to say," he said, "if you're listening. I was never able to do it when I was living." The room went cold. There was no performance. It was an admission. Roy talked slowly and methodically. He discussed the price of celebrity, the friendships that ended in silence, and a portion of his life that he had emotionally and physically shut up. "You won't recognize this name. Ellie helped me through things I couldn't tell anyone," he stated. Ellie was the only voice I trusted after the lights went out and the throng dispersed. He said she knew everything, but he didn't say who she was. Roy continued by discussing a former catastrophe. A night that permanently altered him. "I made a choice," he stated, "and someone else paid for it." His voice broke. He hesitated. "I survived on music. Just music, no laughter, no applause." The tape went on for 25 minutes. He did not weep. He acknowledged that he used the closet to remember the things that the outside world didn't want to see, but he didn't beg for forgiveness. He claimed that all they ever wanted was the smiles, so I granted their request. On the inside, though, I was someone else. He whispered softly to end the recording. "Perhaps now you'll see why I didn't open the door. Shame wasn't the issue. It was a matter of survival." The tape stopped clicking. Nobody made a move. For a brief instant, it seemed as though Roy was still present in the room, sitting next to them, drawing the curtain he had always kept drawn. It was not a fan tape. Legacy wasn't the reason. It broke the image people believed they knew and was for the truth. raw, vulnerable, and indisputable. There was more to Roy Clark's secret than a locked door. A second self had been buried by him. And now that second self had finally awakened, his voice resonating through the quiet. A small, aged, and lockable wooden trunk was located beneath the recordings and folders. Dozens of letters, meticulously kept in plastic wrappers, were within. Some were written on nice stationery, some on ripped notebook paper. Ellie was the name that kept coming up. Just Ellie, with no last name or return address. Roy was the recipient of some letters. Others, from as far back as the 1960s, were obviously authored by him. They lacked romance. They weren't in the corporate world. They were different, they were private yet guarded, like two people conversing in a code. "You were right not to tell them," Ellie said in one letter. "And the stage would never have forgiven you. The world wouldn't understand." "Don't carry this alone," said another. "You weren't at fault. We took the action we believed was appropriate." The tone stayed the same, but the handwriting changed over time. Burdened, contemplative, and haunted. Roy's responses were replete with desire and remorse. "I've built a life out of laughter, but inside it still echoes." He wrote a single letter. "The tires are still audible. I can still see his face." Barbara felt shivers down her spine at that line. She was unaware of any mishap. Who was he? What did Roy mean when he said that he could still hear the tires? They discovered more when they went back to the closet. An envelope, smaller and wax-sealed, was concealed beneath the liner of a guitar case. It included Roy's signature written on the back of a black and white picture of a teenage kid playing a mandolin. "I wish I had taken the wheel." There was another note from Ellie behind it. "He admired you. He pardoned you. Why are you unable to forgive yourself?" The letters, the image, and the mysterious allusions all alluded to a tragedy Roy had concealed for a long time. A young life lost. An unprocessed guilt. Roy had relied on Ellie, whomever she was, to keep him alive in the dark. Through ink and paper, he spilled his soul into a confidant he never mentioned or introduced. These letters weren't from fans. They served as lifelines. And they unveiled Roy Clark, who quietly bled behind the scenes of celebrity. The family understood that they were learning more than simply secrets. They were inheriting sorrow. Every laugh, every song, every show, the kind of sadness that had molded the music, the performances, the man himself, now carried a new burden. And there was only one phrase at the end of the last letter in the stack, which was written few months before Roy passed away. "Someday, I hope, they will discover this. At last, people could realize who you truly were." A lockable black case with worn leather and tight brass latches was sitting in the closet's far corner. There were clean, authentic Toriel cassettes inside, with just vague titles like "Wrong Stage," "The Other Side," and "Midnight" written on them. These weren't studio masters or recordings of concerts. Roy, a guitar, and the kind of silence that only occurs when a guy is totally alone made for unvarnished, private sessions. The first tape started with a chair creaking, then a lengthy sigh, and finally his voice, which was quieter than anyone had ever heard. He sung terribly slowly, as if the lyrics were too heavy for him to bear. "On the screen, I was the idiot. The tears were always mine, even when he spoke in between lyrics. The lyrics lacked polish and cleverness. They were musical confessions. A lonesome drive across Tennessee was described in one song. Rain slicing across headlights. A crash that is clear in its vision but is never named. Shadow in the Mirror," another song, told the story of a man who was unable to look himself in the eye. "Every laugh I gave them stole a piece of me," Roy sung. These weren't intended for public consumption. Only the voice and the truth were present, without any overdubs, harmonies, or banjo tricks. In startled silence, the family listened as track after track revealed decades of suffering, remorse, and desire. Even more startling was the fact that some of the recordings were made in the years when Roy was at the height of his popularity. World TV specials, tours, and awards. He was doing well. But he was disintegrating in these tapes. "No one will hear this, but I had to get it out or I'd drown," he said at the end of one song. The final cassette was the most eerie. Roy didn't sing, he talked straight into the microphone. "I didn't want to ruin what others enjoyed, so I kept these hidden. They desired the smiles and the banjo. However, the individual responsible for all of that is this." Then there was nothing, no static, nothing. The kind of silence that drowns out all other sounds in a room. It wasn't an outtake. They served as therapy and a window into Roy Clark's innermost thoughts and feelings that the public never saw. The song he never wanted anyone to hear, but perhaps needed someone, was now in his family's hands, long after the cheers had subsided. A military briefcase was concealed under a sheet of velvet material beneath the last row of crates. It was cold to the touch, dented, and worn. Roy Clark's military service was unknown to the family. It was absent from liner notes, interviews, and biographies. However, there was a narrative within that case that Roy had never shared, at least not in public. The United States Air Force was imprinted on the documents. His name, his ID number, and a picture of Roy, who was only in his 20s, standing next to a C-47 cargo jet with a grave expression on his face and a guitar slung over one shoulder. A mission log was penned in Roy's meticulous script. Locations: Guam, Japan, and Korea. The dates were in line with the early 1950s. During the Korean War, what was Roy up to overseas? He wasn't a combatant. There was no record of him as a soldier. He was tasked to play music for troops positioned close to active battle zones as part of a clandestine morale team, but the more he dug, the stranger it seemed. Redacted mission records were found. Others made mention to transport flights that were never documented by the government. Dropped near base perimeter, played set under blackout conditions, one entry stated. From East Ridge, enemy fire could be heard. This was more than just amusement. Roy had been transported into hazardous, even explosive, circumstances. He also penned the disturbing comment, "Music kept them alive for one more night." According to what they told me. However, I doubt I've ever returned from that location. Barbara was completely unaware of this. Nor a recollection, nor a casual remark. She suspected that he had buried it so deeply that he even made an effort to forget. A folded American flag and a scribbled list of names of soldiers and fellow musicians were among the papers. They circled one name. Raymond Ellis. Gone next to it. He was not supposed to be on the airplane. A blow to the gut. Was this the man from the previous letter's photo? Was this the one Roy had held himself responsible for losing? Everything would make sense. The tunes that talked of crashes and darkness, the solitude, the remorse. In addition to his celebrity, Roy had to bear the ghosts of a war that no one knew he had witnessed. They were more than secrets. The world couldn't see the wounds. But at last revealed. And instead of portraying Roy Clark as a legend, they did it as a man who had seen too much, lost too much, and somehow managed to make millions of people happy while never letting go of his inner darkness. One more envelope, yellowed, crumpled, and barely tape-sealed, was hidden below the military case at the bottom of the closet, hidden under layers of material. Unlike the others, it was not labeled. "When I'm gone, don't read this or play me." Forgiveness was the only word it uttered. Before opening it, Barbara held it in her hands for a long time. There was a 1968 newspaper clipping inside. A two-vehicle collision on a damp Tennessee road. One person hurt, one died. Ellis Raymond, a 23-year-old Nashville mandolin musician in his prime, was the victim. Roy's handwriting was scrolled in the margin, but the name of the surviving driver was never given. It should have been me behind the wheel. Beside it was a folded paper with words that were wavering and faded. The set had just been completed. I insisted that we drive home even though he claimed to be too exhausted. I assumed I would shut my eyes for 5 minutes, so I let him drive. In the hospital, I awoke. He didn't even wake up. Barbara let the breath out of her lungs. Ellis Raymond had never been familiar to her. Roy had played with him, but I was unaware. I never saw a picture. However, as if it had been penned yesterday, the regret spilled out of the paper. Roy had never been accused. There had been no suspicion of foul play. Even if it was declared an accident, he was always guilty. Now it made more sense to write Ellie the letters. Ellis must have had something to do with her. A sister, a fiancée, the silent recipient of Roy's lifelong confessions. In a single letter, Roy had written, "On every occasion I pay attention and ovation, I see the crash. Each chuckle is an echo of what I stole. I lived and he did not. And that I still don't know why." The track, the military excursions, the hidden songs, it all suddenly aligned. Roy Clark had spent his whole lifestyle smiling for the arena, however mourning in non-public, wearing a dying he felt responsible for, bearing the burden of survival. That night time, the family sat together in silence. No person spoke, no person moved. It changed into as though Roy changed into within the room with them again. Now not the entertainer, however the man. The one who made people snort to preserve himself from breaking. The one who gave the arena pleasure whilst wearing unspeakable sorrow. The one who by no means asked to be forgiven. But actually, so desperately had to be. What they discovered in that envelope wasn't just a tale. It was the lacking piece of his soul. And it changed the whole latte concept they knew about Roy Clark. Whilst the remaining container became emptied and the final letter study, Roy Clark's family stood in a one-of-a-kind residence than the one they had acknowledged. The partitions had been the identical, the furnishings untouched. However, the guy they notioned they knew had converted to the arena. Roy Clark changed into a legend, a country music celeb, the face of hi-ha, a talented musician who ought to make a banjo sing and an audience roar with laughter. However, beyond the spotlight, behind each joke and every status ovation, was a man quietly unraveling. The closet were extra than garage. It became his sanctuary, his graveyard of reminiscence, his non-public confessional. Every item they located became a thread. And whilst pulled collectively, they shaped a tapestry of fact that had been woven in the back of locked doorways for decades. A hidden military past that located him on the edge of fight zones in which track wasn't just leisure, however, a lifeline, a friendship, maybe even a brotherhood cut quick by tragedy, and a moment of sleep behind the wheel that haunted him until his remaining breath. A mysterious female named Ellie, who had become his silent partner in grief, offering Roy a place to dump the ache he could not talk aloud. And songs. Heartbreaking songs. Ones in no way intended for radio or stage. Songs wherein Roy poured the pieces of himself he could not show the general public. Songs that bled. The family listened to them otherwise now. Every strum, each lyric, all at once alive with deeper which means. His laughter wasn't just humor. It became armor. His charm wasn't simply natural. It turned into survival. And hee-haw, for all its silliness, might also have been the finest performance of all. Because at the same time as the arena laughed alongside, Roy became quietly preserving the ghosts at bay. The fact did not smash their love for him. It deepened it. He wasn't just a megastar. He changed into a person who had continued war, tragedy, guilt, and the suffocating weight of silence. And yet, he gave the arena beauty. He gave them laughter. He gave them tune. It's the element that also makes his story outstanding. He may want to have collapsed underneath it all. He could have disappeared into his personal sorrow. However, instead, he rose each day, picked up his guitar, and selected to offer pleasure to others. That sort of strength would not come from talent. It comes from pain. Real ache. And now, after coming across the whole thing that closet held, Roy's family subsequently noticed the total guy. Not simply the performer, now not just the icon, but the person who spent a lifetime smiling through the burden of the unspeakable. they determined to go away the closet door open. Now not as a shrine, no longer as a spectacle, but as an image, a reminder that in the back of each extremely good man, each showbiz legend, there might be a story no one ever sees, a burden no one ever suspects. And sometimes the real overall performance isn't always what's on the degree. It is what is kept hidden whilst the curtain falls. Roy Clark didn't depart behind only a legacy of song. He left at the back of a final act, a whispered truth stored in a closet, anticipating the right second to be heard. And now that it has, it adjustments.